In 1992, two things happened in American motorcycle culture that had nothing to do with each other and everything to do with each other. In Long Beach, California, a former bodyguard named Jesse James, who had spent the late 1980s protecting Soundgarden and Slayer on tour, founded West Coast Choppers in his mother's garage. No loans, no partners, hand tools, a welder, and the specific conviction that a motorcycle could be built to a standard the factory would never match. He built a machine at night and sold fenders during the day for $750 a week to pay the bills. The first WCC chopper was not a product, it was a statement of principle. That same year, Honda released the CBR 900RR Fireblade in America. Designed by Tadao Baba, who had spent years arguing inside Honda's engineering culture for a machine that achieved superbike power in a 600cc class chassis, 893cc, 122 horsepower, a weight of 185 kilograms, lighter than the Honda CBR 600 of the era it competed against. The Fireblade did not announce itself with advertising or celebrity clients. It announced itself by doing something no production motorcycle had done before. It made the performance of a factory race bike available to anyone who could afford it and survive it. Jesse James in his mother's garage, Tadao Baba's Fireblade at your local Honda dealer. Those two things running simultaneously in 1992 are the entire 1990s motorcycle story. The culture that had split in the 1980s between the Harley identity world and the sport bike performance world did not reconcile in the 1990s. It separated further. It developed different languages, different heroes, different values, different relationships to the machine. And by the end of the decade, when Harley's Hog membership had crossed 1 million and the Yamaha R1 had redefined what a production sport bike could be, the two cultures occupied the same roads and shared almost no common vocabulary. I'm Jimmy. This is the decade the split became permanent. The Honda CBR 900RR Fireblade, the Yamaha YZF R1, the Kawasaki ZX9R, Jesse James and West Coast Choppers, the Harley Fatboy and Terminator 2, Hog membership at 1 million, motorcycle fatalities climbing, and the specific moment when American motorcycle culture stopped being one thing and became two things that have not found their way back to each other since. The 1990s Harley-Davidson story begins in 1990 with the introduction of the FLSTF Fatboy, a machine whose design pulled from the visual language of the 1940s and 1950s more deliberately than anything Harley had produced in decades. Solid disc wheels, a wide glide front end, a fat, low profile that communicated mass and deliberateness rather than the lean aggression of a sport machine. The Fatboy was not subtle. It was designed to be looked at. On July 3, 1991, Terminator 2, Judgment Day, opened in American cinemas. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the most physically imposing screen presence in Hollywood, rode a Harley-Davidson Fatboy through the film's most iconic chase sequence. The motorcycle did not play a supporting role, it played a lead. The image of Schwarzenegger on the Fatboy, shotgun in one hand, navigating the Los Angeles drainage canal at speed while a 10-ton truck pursued him, was the motorcycle image that entered the American popular imagination in 1991 and stayed there. Sales of the Fatboy after Terminator 2 were not coincidental. The Harley-Davidson of 1990 was not the Harley-Davidson of 1981. The buyout decade had produced the Evolution engine, the soft-tail frame, the Hog, and a brand repositioning that had transformed the motorcycle from a working-class transportation tool into the most powerful status object in the American premium consumer market. A new Fatboy in 1990 cost $10,000. That price point did not exclude the working-class rider, but it included, deliberately, the professional class rider who was now the primary growth demographic. The baby boomers were in their 40s, the generation that had grown up with Easy Rider, that had watched the chopper era, that had not themselves necessarily ridden, but had understood motorcycles as the symbols of freedom that their generation valued. These men now had the disposable income to buy the symbol. And the Harley-Davidson Fatboy after Terminator 2 was the most recognizable motorcycle symbol in the history of American popular culture. The Hog, the Harley Owners Group, founded in 1983 with 33 members, had grown through the mid-80s and continued through the 1990s in a way that no one had projected. The specific number that matters, Hog had 200,000 members in 1990. It had 1 million members by 2000. The largest single brand owner organization in the history of the motorcycle industry grew 5 times over in a single decade. That growth was not organic in the way that working class motorcycle culture had grown organically. Through need, through mechanical interest, through the specific attraction of people who genuinely wanted to ride. It was marketing-driven growth, aspirational consumer growth, the growth of a lifestyle brand that happened to have a machine at its center. I personally think the distinction between organic cultural growth and marketing-driven aspirational growth matters enormously for understanding what happened to motorcycle culture in the 1990s. The riders who came to Harley through the hog in the 1990s were not bad riders or illegitimate riders. They were people who genuinely valued what the machine represented, but they valued representation. They valued the symbol, and a culture that grows primarily through the attraction of symbol seekers rather than machine understanders changes in ways that the people who built it on mechanical competence can feel even when they cannot fully name. Tadao Baba spent years inside Honda's engineering organization arguing for a machine that should not have been possible. The motorcycle world of the late 1980s operated on an established understanding. A superbike, a machine producing superbike power, was large and heavy. The power required a large engine. The large engine required a large chassis. The large chassis required a heavy structure. These were not arbitrary limitations. They were engineering realities that everyone building sport bikes accepted as constraints. Baba did not accept them. His specific argument was this: the limiting factor in a street-ridden sport bike is not power output. It is total system weight. A motorcycle that weighs less can accelerate faster with the same power, stop shorter with the same brakes, and change direction more quickly with the same suspension. If you could achieve superbike power in a machine that weighed what a middleweight weighed, you would have something that could outperform a superbike in every real-world condition. The CBR 900RR that arrived in 1992 was the proof of that argument. 893 cubic centimeters, not the full liter that convention expected. 122 horsepower, and a curb weight that undercut every machine in its performance class by a significant margin. The Fireblade was smaller than its competitors, more compact. When riders first encountered it at dealers, the consistent response was, it looks smaller than it should be. The wheelbase was shorter than a CBR 600. The machine that was competing with liter bikes could be mistaken, standing still, for something with considerably less displacement. On the road, the Fireblade was not forgiving. The compact chassis, the short wheelbase, the responsive steering geometry, these characteristics produced a machine that required genuine skill to use at its limits. The comment from the Late Break Show's Fireblade video, 332,000 views, says what riders who owned early blades consistently say: I remember when the Fireblade came out, it was such a radical game changer at the time. Another rider, the old blade is one of the absolute best looking street bikes ever made. The colors, the holes in the fairing, the dual headlight, gorgeous. A third, my 1998 Fireblade still delivers in spades on real roads. These are not nostalgic generalities, they are specific technical appreciations from riders who understand what made the machine exceptional. The Fireblade's genius was not that it was fast. Many machines were fast. Its genius was that it was fast and light and handled, that it achieved the combination of qualities that serious riders actually needed on real roads. The gap between what the Fireblade could do and what the average buyer could safely access was, however, real and growing. A machine producing 122 horsepower in a chassis weighing 185 kilograms does not manage the mistakes of an inexperienced rider. It amplifies them. The rider who bought a Fireblade in 1992 at 22 years old, with 2 years of riding experience behind him, was not insufficiently talented. He was insufficiently experienced for what the machine demanded. By the mid-1990s, motorcycle fatality data was telling a story that the manufacturers and the industry press were not telling. Motorcycle deaths in the United States had declined through the mid-1980s, partly because of the safety culture that the MSF had been building since its founding in 1973, and partly because the machines of that era, while fast by the standards of their time, were not as exponentially capable as what was coming. Through the 1990s, the fatality data began showing specific patterns. The sport bike category, the machines in the CBR900RR class and the ZX9R class and the GSXR1100R class was producing a disproportionate share of fatal accidents relative to the number of machines in service. Younger riders. Shorter riding histories. Machines with power-to-weight ratios that exceeded the competence of the average new rider. The specific dynamic was not complicated. A new rider at 22 could walk into a dealership, put down a deposit on a CBR 900RR, and ride away on a machine producing 122 horsepower. Nothing in the purchase process asked him to demonstrate the competence that machine required. Nothing in the dealer's interest was served by suggesting that a different machine might be more appropriate. The MSF Basic Rider Course, an excellent program that taught fundamental motorcycle operation, could be completed in a weekend. The skills it certified were the skills needed to operate a motorcycle safely at legal speeds on empty roads. They were not the skills needed to use 122 horsepower safely in traffic. I personally think this is the most important and least discussed fact about the 1990s motorcycle culture. The performance gap, the space between what the machines could produce and what the average rider who purchased them could safely use, was widening with every model year. And the manufacturers were not slowing the escalation because escalations sold machines. The fatality data did not cause the manufacturers to limit performance. It caused insurers to limit coverage. Young male riders on high-displacement sport bikes faced insurance premiums that reflected the actuarial reality, even when the cultural conversation around the machines refused to. If you know someone who rode in the 1990s, whether on a sport bike or a Harley, whether they are still riding or whether they lost someone to the performance gap that nobody was talking about, honestly, share this video with them. The story of what was actually happening in 1990s motorcycle culture behind the Terminator, Too Fat Boy, and the Fireblade brochure has never been told this directly. Share it with your riding group, your family and friends, anyone who wants to understand where the culture they love actually came from. Every share puts this history in front of someone who needs it. If the Fireblade was the opening argument of the 1990 SE Sport bike era, the Yamaha YZF R1 of 1998 was its conclusion. The ZX9R arrived from Kawasaki in 1994 as their response to the Fireblade, a machine that matched the Honda in the compact chassis with high power formula while adding Kawasaki's specific character. The machines were competing not just for sales, but for the specific honor of being the fastest production motorcycle in the world. That honor moved with each model year update. Suzuki's GSXR evolved. Honda updated the Fireblade. Kawasaki updated the Ninja line. The competitive iteration compressed the development cycle in ways that peacetime engineering normally does not experience. In 1998, Yamaha produced a machine that the motorcycle press described in terms that sounded like hyperbole until you read the specification sheet. The YZF R1 produced 150 horsepower from a 998cc inline 4 engine. It weighed 177 kilograms, lighter than the Fireblade it was competing with. The power-to-weight ratio was closer to a racing machine than anything that had previously been sold through a street motorcycle dealer. The R1 did to the late 1990s sport bike world what the Ninja had done to the early 1980s sport bike world. It created a before and an after. The machines that preceded it were suddenly measurably slower. The manufacturers who had spent the decade incrementally improving their products were now facing a step-change competitor that reset the performance floor. The comment on the Suzuki GSXR history video, 1.36 million views, 811 comments, captures what riders who lived through this period felt. The Japanese build the best motorcycles on the planet, 40 years ago and still today. Those of us that love and have had the honor to experience riding on such affordable, well-made motorcycles owe the Japanese a huge thank you. Another rider, I started on a 1988 GSX R750. Mine was a year old, and I was 20. I'll never forget it. Best time of my life. That last comment contains the entire 1990s sport bike experience in 2 sentences. Started young, on a machine a year older than the current model, making it slightly more accessible. Never forgot it. The best time of his life. That description. Young, capable machine. Formative experience was not confined to one rider. It describes a generation. What the comment does not say, because the comment is about gratitude and memory, not about the people who did not make it, is what the fatality statistics document. The generation that had the best time of their lives on 1990s sport bikes was also the generation that lost more of its members per mile ridden than any previous generation in motorcycle history. Both things are true. The machines were extraordinary. The gap between what they could do and what their average rider could safely use was real and had real consequences. The 1990s was the decade that produced both of those truths simultaneously and never resolved the tension between them. While the Japanese manufacturers were waging the performance war, Jesse James was doing something in Long Beach that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with what performance had abandoned. West Coast Choppers, founded in 1992 in his mother's garage, initially selling t-shirts and stickers to fund the machine building perhaps 12 to 15 choppers per year at prices that started at $50,000, was the opposite of what the sport bike world represented. Where the sport bikes were about measurable, documented, track-tested performance, the WCC chopper was about something that no dynamometer could measure. It was about the relationship between the builder and the machine, made visible in the specific choices of every fabricated component. Jesse James learned fabrication from Boyd Coddington, the legendary hot rod builder who had himself built a culture around the idea that a machine could be entirely handmade, that every component could be the product of specific human skill rather than factory production. From Coddington, James took the fundamental principle. The maker understands the object completely because the maker produced every part of it. There is no black box. There is no component whose function is unknown. The machine is an extension of the builder's knowledge. The WCC chopper of the early 1990s was not a Harley-Davidson product with aftermarket parts. It was a machine built from the ground up, using a Harley's mechanical components as raw material and the builder's vision as the actual determinant of what the final object was. Extended front forks, hand-fabricated tanks, rigid frames. The aesthetic was deliberately stripped, deliberately aggressive, deliberately opposite to the chrome and leather comfort orientation of the HOG Boomer Harley. Jesse James in his mother's garage in 1992 was doing what Arlen Ness had done in his San Leandro garage in 1963, taking the available materials, applying the available skill, building something that had not existed before. The difference was the decade. Ness had built in a decade when the working class motorcycle culture was still the dominant frame. James was building in a decade when the HOG had 500,000 members and growing, when the Harley had become a premium aspirational product, when the working class origin of the custom culture was being rapidly gentrified into a lifestyle category. The specific irony, which would become clear in the 2000s Sissy when West Coast Choppers became a television phenomenon, is that Jesse James's garage work, done in opposition to the commercialization of motorcycle culture, would itself become the seed of the most commercially successful custom motorcycle operation of the early 21st century. The opposition to the brand became the brand. The culture that rejected the lifestyle category became the most visible lifestyle category available. That irony was still invisible in 1992. The machine in the garage was just the machine in the garage. Sturgis in the 1990s was the barometer of everything that was happening to American motorcycle culture simultaneously. In 1990, approximately 100,000 riders came to Sturgis. By 1995, attendance had grown significantly. By 1999, the end of the decade, attendance was routinely approaching 500,000 in peak years, making it the largest annual motorcycle gathering on Earth by a margin that no other event came close to matching. Those attendance numbers contained both of the 1990s stories in one place. The Harley Boomer riding in on a fat boy with his hog patch. The sport bike rider who had driven the canyon roads of South Dakota at speeds that the South Dakota Highway Patrol noted with professional concern. The independent custom builders who'd been coming since the decade when 3,000 riders attended and camped in the city park. The Vietnam veterans who had been coming since before the hog existed, who remembered what it had been and watched what it was becoming. Sturgis in the 1990s was not hostile to any of these communities. It was the specific place where they all shared the same geography for 10 days each August without sharing the same culture. The Harley boomer and the sport bike rider and the independent builder and the Vietnam veteran were all at Sturgis. They camped in different areas. They gathered at different venues. They rode different roads at different speeds for different reasons. They waved at each other on the highways because that was the protocol of the motorcycle world. They did not necessarily understand what the wave meant to the person on the other side of it. The Black Hills Motor Classic had been founded by Pappy Howell in 1938 with 9 racers and 200 spectators and weenies for lunch in a tent behind a garage. By the mid-1990s, the event that Pappy had turned over to the city of Sturgis in the 1980s was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual economic activity for South Dakota. The racing, the flat track, and the hill climb that had been the original reason for the gathering was still happening at the Jack Pine Gypsies track. But the racing was buried under concerts and vendor markets and commercial infrastructure that had grown to match the attendance. The Jack Pine Gypsies still ran the track. The race was still the heart. But you had to know where the heart was to find it under everything that had grown around it. By the mid-1990s, the two cultures that had split in the 1980s had become so distinct that the question of what connected them, beyond the basic fact of 2 wheels and an engine, was genuinely difficult to answer. The Harley world of the 1990s was organized around community, identity, heritage, and the specific emotional resonance of a brand that had survived near death and come back as something that felt more American than any other product in the consumer market. The HOG gave its members events, organized rides, a magazine, a community structure that did everything a club had traditionally done, but with the corporate backing of the manufacturer whose machine the club was organized around. For a baby boomer who had never belonged to an AMA-sanctioned club and had not grown up in the working-class motorcycle community, the HOG was genuinely welcoming. It asked nothing except membership dues and the purchase of a Harley. The sport bike world of the 1990s was organized around performance, technical competence, speed, and the specific culture of riders who wanted to test themselves against what the machine could do. The track days that were becoming a feature of American motorcycle culture through the 1990s organized sessions at road racing circuits where riders could explore their machine's performance in a controlled environment, were the sport bike community's equivalent of the HOG organized ride. But track days asked something different. They asked the rider to demonstrate competence. They sorted for skill in a way that membership dues did not. These two organizing principles, community and membership versus performance and competence, produced different kinds of riders and different relationships to the machine. Neither was wrong. Both were real. But they were not the same thing, and the culture that had built American motorcycling on the shared foundation of mechanical knowledge that both kinds of rider needed to develop was losing its ability to serve as that common foundation. The working-class rider who had built the culture, who had maintained his own shovelhead, who had rebuilt his carburetors and set his own points and diagnosed oil leaks by location, was still out there. He was in his 50s now. He recognized the Harley HOG boomer and the sport bike kid both as motorcyclists and both as people who had found something real in the machine. He also recognized that neither of them was inheriting the specific knowledge culture he had been part of. The HOG had a dealer service department for that. The sport bike had become reliable enough that it did not demand the attention a shovelhead had demanded. I personally think the 1990s is the decade when the question, what does it mean to be a real rider, became genuinely contested in a way it had not been before. Not because anyone new to the culture was wrong to want to participate, but because the culture no longer had a single answer to give them. The question of what connects these two worlds, the Harley HOG culture and the sport bike culture, is the question every rider on American roads is still living with. If you know someone on the other side of that divide from you, a Harley rider who has never understood why anyone would want a sport bike, or a sport bike rider who has never understood why anyone would want a Harley, share this video with them. The history of how that divide formed is the beginning of understanding it. Post it in your writing group, send it to family and friends. The conversation that motorcycle culture never finished having in the 1990s is worth starting now. By 1999, the decade had produced its verdict. The Harley hog culture was the most commercially successful motorcycle phenomenon in American history. 1 million members, waiting list for new machines, a brand that had gone from 15% market share in its category in the early 1980s to a position of dominance achieved not through performance competition, but through cultural authority. The Harley had become the American motorcycle, not because it was the fastest or the most reliable or the most technologically advanced, but because it carried the specific cultural weight of American freedom, working class heritage, and the specific romance of the open road that no amount of Japanese engineering could replicate in the American popular imagination. The sport bike world had produced a performance war that ended the decade with the Yamaha R1, 150 horsepower, 177 kilograms, a machine whose specifications would have been science fiction in 1984 when the first Ninja arrived. The performance escalation had created machines of extraordinary capability that the average young American rider could purchase but not always safely use. The fatality data was real, the competence gap was real, and the performance war was not over. The machines that would arrive in the early 2000s would make the R1 look conservative. Jesse James was still in Long Beach, still building 12 to 15 choppers per year by hand, still operating in the underground between the two worlds that were dominating the cultural conversation. He would not become famous until 2000, when the Discovery Channel made him the subject of a documentary, the most watched show in Discovery Channel history at that time. The seed that had been planted in his mother's garage in 1992 was about to flower in ways that would transform the custom chopper from an underground culture into the dominant motorcycle aesthetic of the early 2000s. But that is a story for the next decade. What the 1990s left behind was the question that neither the hog culture nor the sport bike culture had answered. What is the thing that connects all riders to each other beyond the basic fact of two wheels? What is the shared foundation when the knowledge requirements have been relaxed, when the community has been organized by marketing as well as by genuine affinity, when the machines have become so capable that the gap between what they can do and what their average rider can safely do has become a documented social problem? The riders who know the answer to that question are still out there. They are the ones who maintain their own machines, who understand every system, who can diagnose by sound and feel and smell in addition to the diagnostic code reader. They are in every corner of the culture: Harley garages and sport bike communities and independent builder shops. They are the foundation under the surface that the 1990s made more visible than any decade before it. The surface and the foundation. The 1960s separated them. The 1990s put the widest distance between them of any decade. And the question of whether they can ever fully close that distance again is the question that American motorcycle culture is still trying to answer.